in for the village. He bought a bacon slicer. And, you know, he was raising a lot of his own food. And George Orwell, back to the earth, do-it-yourselfer. Who knew? But he clearly also took immense pleasure in it and in observing the weather and the wild animals and the natural world and the farmland around him. But I also think, as a writer myself, you can't write 24/7. You don't just churn it out like some industrial product or a sweatshop worker. Most writing is thinking, and sometimes you have to go away from it and come back fresh. Sometimes you think best by doing something else. And so I think one of the beautiful things he exemplifies is that the things we might need to do in our lives that will seem to others, and God knows there are so often those others, especially if you're on the left, will seem to others trivial, irrelevant, indulgent, etc., might be things you need to do the most important work in your life, even though they're not that work themselves. There's this very funny moment where he's writing for the left-wing magazine Tribune. He's a columnist there. A woman writes in to tell him that flowers are bourgeois, and it's such a hilarious pronouncement. You know, she assumes all flowers are decorative and ornamental, and of course, you can go into so many layers of that. Why shouldn't we have beauty? But also, flowering plants are responsible for almost everything we eat. And this dismissal is, you know, there's so many layers of amusement to it. And Orwell wrote in defense of flowers in many different ways and celebrated those roses in his work.
You mentioned 1936, and I mean, this is, yes, when he gets the cottage, but it's also the world is changing and about to fall apart, and things are in the midst of wild flux. What did that, in that time, what do you think the garden gave him as things are changing?
One of the things that was really striking is he'd just spent time in the mining districts near Manchester in northern England looking at, for his book, The Road to Wigan-Tyre, the conditions of the unemployed, a kind of deep poverty I don't think he'd seen in England. You know, hardworking people or unemployed people who wanted work, whole families just living in dire, dire poverty without enough clothing, enough food, enough heating. And then the brutal conditions of the coal mines, men working almost naked in these tunnels that might only be 3 feet high, where they face the everyday toxicity of coal, the possibility of explosions, mining collapse, unbreathable air you could suffocate in, and all kinds of injury. And it felt in a way like, first of all, planting a garden in this beautiful rural part of southern England was making a world as unlike the mining district and the coal mines as possible, doing something beautiful, something with integrity, something where work was dignified and meaningful and free in some way, as opposed to the coal miners. And also that he was really just sort of rooting himself, building a strong foundation for the life he intended to lead. He was engaged to Eileen O'Shaughnessy, who would come and join him in the cottage in June. But of course, then he goes off to the Spanish Civil War in December, spends 6 months there, gets wounded, becomes terribly ill, not because of the wound, but with his chronic lung condition, goes to Morocco to convalesce, but ultimately keeps coming back to the cottage, keeps gardening, keeps tending those chickens and goats. And it's clear that between the coal mines and unemployed of northern England and the anti-fascism in Spain, he becomes the political writer that we know him as. He leaves behind the much more juvenile, more peevish, more prejudiced writer he was before, and really kind of steps into his own in a way, really beginning in 1936. So it's almost the beginning of everything, including the Orwell that I think we all value.
You wonder whether him planting the garden in the wake of what he saw in the mines was sort of like an act of resistance in some ways.
You know, and it's an act of resistance, very much like the acts that Winston Smith makes in 1984. You know, he's not liberating the miners or overcoming it, but he's at least making a small-scale world in which work has integrity and beauty and meaning, and spend time with plants, which he clearly derives great pleasure from, as do we all, or most of us, I think.
You say that we all, or many of us, derive pleasure from plants. And there's a moment in the book in which you talk about what's been happening lately where people decide that they want to perhaps abandon, that industrialized life and go back to a more rugged existence, a more rural existence. They want to get their hands dirty. They want to feel like they're doing something meaningful by moving into the middle of nowhere and growing a farm or something like that. And you say that yearning is often a white collar yearning. What do you mean by that? And how does that idea play out differently depending on who we happen to be?
Well, one layer of that is Orwell himself observes that a lot of middle-class boys like him thought farm labor was very attractive, but it was what they saw, herding the sheep, mowing the hay. It wasn't getting up at 4 a.m. on a bitter winter day to milk the cows, hoeing turnips in bitter cold. And I learned this from kind of downwardly mobile in some way.
Get all.
Ain't it the truth or is it just me? Raise a glass now for everyone. All God's children under the sun. Raise a glass now for only me. Cold and broken, lonely me.
Self-determination do you have? What is that work? Did you choose it? Are you free? And of course, those are questions we can ask about anything.
Just finally, where do you find the joy in difficult times? I mean, you wrote about walking and
What the? When okay, I'm leaving, getting in a taxi, kissing the backseat, tell the driver make the radio play, and I'm singing like, girl, you know I want your love. Your love was handmade for somebody like me. Come on now, follow my lead. I may be crazy, don't mind me. Say, boy, let's not talk too much. Grab on my waist and put that body on me. Come on now, follow my lead. Come on now, follow my lead. I'm in love with the shape of you. Push and pull like a magnet do. Although my heart is falling too. I'm in love with your body. Last night you were in my room. Now my bedsheets smell like you. Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with your body. I'm in love with your body. I'm in love with your body. I'm in love with your body.
Break bread for the ones who are in.
Trying to change the world